Hello, and thank you for tuning into the frequency of a new awareness. Today, we are going to look at the reaction of the Catholic Church toward the Cathars. If you want to know what the Cathar movement was all about, what they believed and what they taught, I made the previous video about Cathar origins and belief. You may want to look at that first to understand why the Catholic Church reacted the way they did. Also, the Cathar movement was considered the biggest heresy of history. But then what is heresy? What is a heretic? You know, when we hear these words today, it has this negative tint to it, this negative interpretation, so to speak. But what does it really mean? Where do these words come from? And here we find in ancient Greece and even in the ancient Roman Empire, a heretic was a student of philosophies, a student of spiritual practices, a student of different religious practices. So, he was considered a noble man. That was a noble cause. You know, the ancient Greek, they were very interested in new ideas and new philosophies. They were really hungry for new wisdom. So that was a noble cause. And the process of studying these different philosophies in order to find out which ones is right for me and which ones I'm going to make mine and are going to be a part of was called heresy. But when in the Roman Empire, the Apostolic and Catholic Church was declared state religion, these people who studied different religions and different philosophies and spiritual practices were not really wanted anymore. They were not really accepted anymore, and therefore they were persecuted. So what used to be a noble cause was not something that was persecuted. And therefore a heretic was now something bad and something negative. And the Catholic Church had, this general approach: if you're not for us, you're against us. And when you're against us, we have to eliminate you. So this is the basic idea behind being a heretic. And it has nothing to do with right or wrong. Or did they study or teach what the Bible taught, or Bible truth, or what Jesus taught? It had nothing to do with this. The only criteria to be called a heretic was if you were standing against the Catholic Church and had viewpoints that were not lining up with the viewpoint of the Catholic Church. And who decided who was a heretic? The Catholic Church. So it's really really mind-boggling to see the I don't know. It's today's standards. When we look back in history in the Dark Ages and even further back, and we see what the Catholic Church did and what they turned something good and positive into something bad and negative, it's actually very, very, very sad. So now we know the Cathars, their only crime was they didn't agree with the Catholic Church, and on top of it, they decided to criticize the Catholic Church. That's why they were called a heresy, and they were heretics. Now the question arises, Why did it take the Catholic Church until the 11th century uh, to pay attention to the Cathar movement? Why didn't they pay attention much sooner when the movement was small and was easily to eradicate? So why did they wait until the 11th century? I think there are several reasons. One is that they did not have the power of the sword until the year 751. That was the year when they conspired with the noble house against the previous king of France, the Merovingians, to put in there to help to put a noble house into the house and to the position of the king of France in order to have power of the sword. And from that time, it probably took another 100 or 200 years in order to make the nobility or the powerful nobility in the kingdom of France and the king of France himself to do their bidding, to make them dependent and do easily do what the Pope wanted them to do. But also, I believe there were other reasons when we think about the cornerstone of the Catholic Church being the lust for power and greed. Now, in the 11th century, it became very obvious that many nobilities in the south of France, in the Languedoc region, converted from Catholicism to the Cathar movement. And therefore, they lost influence over the people. Because you have to understand, in the Dark Ages, when the peasants, the little farmers and workers, the people who lived within the rim of a noble house, they were basically part of the noble house. They were part of the rim. They were not free to move around and go here, go there. When they were there, that it was like slavery, so to speak. So when the noble man declared himself to be Catholic, that meant that his whole rim was Catholic. So when more and more noble households turned to the Cathar movement, that meant also that a lot of people turned to the Cathar movement. Or not necessarily to the Cathar movement because they never forced anybody to join them, but it meant that they would turn away from being Catholic. So they lost power in the region, and because they turned away from the Catholic Church and joined the Cathar movement, there were no more money flowing to the Catholic Church, to the Vatican at that time. So that's when the Catholic Church paid attention. Also, in the region, the Cathars and the Catholics lived in peace together. The Cathars were a peaceful people. They were not violent and needed power or influence. They gave a lot of themselves. They gave a high spiritual value and expected nothing or very little in return. And the Catholic Church was directly the opposite. They gave very little spiritual help and demanded a lot of financial return. So the people lived in peace. And the violence was brought in when the institution of the Catholic Church, the Vatican, got involved. And in their, how do you say that? In their belief that they are the only people to represent God and that they have the only way to salvation and this conviction, and they have told themselves this lie for several hundred years that they said, okay, if they want to convert, if they don't want to convert to Catholicism, then we have to take rougher measures. So the first step they did was send missionaries into the Languedoc region in order to convince the Cathars to join the Catholic Church. So the Catholic Church never ever investigated the truth of what the Cathars actually taught. Was it biblical? Was it what Jesus taught? Was it in harmony with Christianity? That was never in question. That was never part of the equation. The only thing the Cathars had against them was they criticized the Catholic Church. And that is something they could not tolerate, because the whole power structure relied on this superiority and this only existence of Catholic belief and doctrine. So when the missionary movement or the missionary mission failed, and it failed completely, then they had the excuse to call in more drastic measures.
After persuasion through the missionary trips have failed, the Catholic Church decided in the year 1209 through the Pope Innocent III to call for the Albigensian Crusade. The crusade lasted 20 years until the year 1229. It is hard to believe that the first genocide in European history was committed by the Catholic Church. During the span of 20 years, it is estimated that 500,000 people were killed in the process. For that time, it was a vast amount. We are not going to go through all the details of the crusade, battles, and so forth. We are just going to pick two events that symbolize this crusade. And it was the first city the Crusaders attacked. And the leader of the crusade was a man called Simon de Montfort. It was a French nobleman that led the crusade because the Vatican did not have an own army. So they persuaded the secular world, the noblemen, to lead the crusade. And this man answered the call and was their leader. The first city they came to was the city of Béziers. I'm probably pronouncing this wrong, but in about 2 days, the city was occupied and conquered. But this man, Simon de Montfort, had a problem. He could not differentiate between the Catholics and the Cathars. So he went to the emissary of the Catholic Church who was present during the crusade. And he asked him what to do. And this man supposedly answered, and to me it makes sense, that God knows his own and he should kill everybody in that city. So he did. In the course of one day, between 15 and 20,000 people were butchered in the name of God and the crusade, initiated by the Pope Innocent III. It's hard to believe that a Pope who can authorize and instigate a human genocide called himself innocent. You know, it's all this, it's power to the course of hypocrisy. So, and the crusade went on for 20 years, and at the end of 20 years, there was a last stronghold that needed to be conquered, and it was a stronghold of Montségur. Again, probably pronounced wrong, but it was on top of a rock, a mountain, and it was besieged by the Crusaders. And shortly after, or before, the Crusaders won the battle, uh, legend has it that a group of Cathar priests climbed down this cliff and escaped with something called the Cathar treasure. As we have already discussed in a previous video about the Cathars, what this treasure might have been. So it was very likely that they wanted to keep their scriptures because they probably knew that if their scriptures fall into the hands, their writings, that their teachings of the two Marys, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Jesus, would uh, be destroyed. So probably somewhere in this world there are these writings, and sooner or later they will come for us to read. So after the siege and Monseigneur was conquered, the crusade ended, and the Catholic Church has done their homework. The Cathar movement has been annihilated, and it was the end of it. Now we have seen just like the historic events, and we know we can look in the history books and read about the battles and what happened and the events and so forth. But what we cannot read about is the emotion, how the people felt, how they related to all of this. And the source for that is the history of the Inquisition. If you want to read a bad horror story, you read the book called The History of the Inquisition, written by Henry Charles Lear. And there we quote now a little bit about the emotions, the what the people felt and how they related to it. And we read here, right here, in on page 105, we start reading here, right here, and it reads, it's not easy for us to realize what there was in the faith of the Cathari to inspire men with the enthusiastic zeal of martyrdom. But no religion can show a more unbroken roll of those who unshrinkingly and joyfully fought death in its most abhorrent form in preference to apostasy. So there is no religion that they say, including the Catholic religion, that can show such a zeal for their faith that they prefer to die rather than turn away from their faith. So, and it reads on, if the blood of the martyrs were really the seed of the church, Manichaeism would now be the dominant religion of Europe. They write here Manichaeism because the Catholic Church believed that Manichaeism was the first one there in the Roman Empire, and then it proceeded through time in different places, but it's all the same teaching. But in a previous video about the Cathars, I have shown you that this is not the case. So please look at that video to get the details. So we can write here Cathars. If we replace this, Catharism would now be the dominant religion of Europe. And imagine how our world would look like If a movement or a religion that really lived up to the love of God by example and who provided us a way how we can have a higher consciousness awareness and be one with God, one with the creative source, how would our world today look like? But instead, uh, the collective consciousness on Earth was not high enough, so the Cathars didn't have a chance of survival, and the darkness of the Catholic Church prevailed, and we had the history that we had. But we read on. It may be partially explained by the belief that the painful death for the faith ensured the return of the soul to God. But human weakness does not often permit such a habitual triumph of the spirit over the flesh as that which rendered the Cathari a proverb in their thirst for martyrdom. You see, there is the Catholics basically um, honor these people in having such a strong um, faith that the spirit can triumph over the flesh. And that is exactly what Jesus taught and what we read in the Bible, that to overcome the flesh, the ego, the earthly desires, and that's what the Cathars achieved and lived by. And you can see the admiration that the writer had here for these people. The hostile testimony to this effect is virtually unanimous. In the earliest persecution on record at Orleans, about 1017, out of 15, 13 remained steadfast in the face of the fire kindled for their destruction. They refused to recant, though pardon was offered, and their constancy was a wonderment of the spectators. You see, even though they knew they were burned at the stake, I mean, death through fire must be a horrible way to die. And even though they were all offered pardon, they chose death because they know where they're going. And the wonderment of the spectators and the spectators had admiration for these people. You have to understand, in the dark ages, these executions of any kind were an event. The whole village or the city came together to watch it, and they were standing there in wonderment and admired the people for their steadfastness. So here we can see already how the strong the Cathari faith was, and we can read here in the next page here, at page 106 here, right there at the end, right here, and there's absolutely no evidence that the Cathari ever wavered in their trust in Christ or diverted their aspirations from the hope of reunion with God. I mean, you cannot but absolutely see that they really believed what Jesus taught. And they were not just talking about it, but they acted upon it. In contrast to the Catholic Church, they only talked about it, but what they did, we know. So we go further on the next page here and continue reading here, right here. And it says, such was a phase whose rapid spread throughout the south of Europe filled the church with well grounded dismay. So so the Catharism, spread very fast, and that was concerning to the church, and it was for good reason because the existence of the Catholic Church was at stake. And however much we may depreciate the means used for its suppression and commiserate those who suffered for conscience' sake, we cannot but admit that the cause of orthodoxy was in this case the cause of progress and civilization. I mean, I mean, this is just horrendous, you know. And even though we now looking back maybe depreciate the means of killing and torturing and burning at the stake was not really a good thing to do, we have to admit that at the time, the way the cause of orthodoxy, the straight path of the Catholic Church, was a cause of progress and civilization. So they said the Catholic Church brings progress and civilization. I mean, how can a butchery of people mean progress and civilization? What kind of civilization is killing people and killing fellow Christians? This is just, there you can see the arrogance of the Catholic Church and the right to just do whatever they feel like doing to support their power. And it reads on, had Catharism become dominant, or even had it been allowed to exist on equal terms, its influence could not have failed to prove disastrous. And there should have been written disastrous for the Catholic Church. Uh, if that would have happened, the Catholic Church, as we know it today with the Vatican, would probably not exist. It would probably be playing a very, very minor role in the landscape of Christian religion. So here we can see that how much integrity and faith the Cathars had in contrast to the Catholic Church, and how they were admired for their faith. And it's exactly how the first century Christians, or the followers of the way that Jesus inaugurated, were looked upon. The people of the time in the first century looked at the people with admiration and respect, even though they stayed away from them. They had respect. And just as the people of the time in the 12th century, and it's now 13th century, through the Inquisition, had the same honor and respect and for the Cathar people as they had back time. So there's a you know Jesus said, when they persecute me, they will persecute you. And the Cathar people were persecuted in a very barbaric way by the Catholic Church. So they will see how a little bit about the emotion and what's going on among the people there during the Inquisition and the Crusade and this genocide. There is one more question I want to answer, and that is, how does the Catholic Church feel about what they have done there 800 years ago? And we can find that at the newadvent.com website. It's a Catholic website, and we read here the attitude of the Church towards the Cathars, or Albigensianism. And now let's read what they say today about what they did 800 years ago. Now let's read. Properly speaking, Albigensianism was not a Christian heresy, but an extra Christian religion. Wow. So it was not a Christian heresy, an extra, whatever that means, extra Christian. What is an extra Christian? Even you're a Christian or not. So they want to differentiate they were extra Christian, not Christian like us, but also Christian, just different. So they admit that the Cathars or the Albigensians were not a heresy. Now, ecclesiastical authorities or church authority, after persuasion had failed, adopted a course of severe repression, which led at times to regrettable excess. Well, I mean, this is nice, nicely written. Um, genocide is regrettable excess. Wow, you know, it's let's downplay. Let's not take responsibility. But here now, the Simon of Montfort, so the leader of the crusade, intended well at first, but later used the pretext of religion to usurp the territory of the Counts of Toulouse. Now, there is again a lie in that, because in order to keep these noblemen with their armies motivated for 20 years, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, gave them a really nice incentive and saying every territory that they conquer and every nobleman that belonged to the Cathar movement were put out of power, they could keep the land and call it theirs. So to that the usurp the territory of the Count of Toulouse was the incentive, but now it's used as an excuse. You know, the Catholic Church uh, created the environment for the whole crusade to get out of hand, and now they're blaming this man here instead of taking responsibility for themselves. So now we read on. The death penalty was indeed inflicted too freely on the Albigenses, but it must be remembered that the penal code of the time was considerably more rigorous than ours today, and the excess were sometimes provoked. So here it writes, it was just the time. The time was evil. The penalties, the death penalty, was freely given, and it was just normal at the time. So what's the big deal here? Now here is a big deal. The Catholic Church says they are the lighthouse of God, they're ambassadors of Christ, and we bring the light of God and the love of God to the people, and we preach salvation through Christ, and on and on and on. Um, so they should have been acting with compassion and love, but they basically saying here it wasn't possible. It was just a time. But the Cathars proved them wrong. They proved that even though the time was evil and they were still upholding the love of God, and they acted with compassion and harmony with the world around them. So they did what actually did in action what the Catholic Church was talking about, but never do. So they say that was just the time. So the Catholic Church just was one of the guys, one of the parties that contributed to this badness through this evil. They were part of the evil, not part of God and the love. So that's what they basically admit here at the time. So it's another excuse. So we read on. Raymond the Sixth and his successor Raymond the Seventh were, when in distress, ever ready to promise, but never to earnestly amend. So Raymond the Sixth and Raymond the Seventh were the strongest and biggest nobility family and clans that supported the Cathar movement and were supporting it. And when the Catholic Church pressured them, or the Crusade army pressured them, they said, "Oh, come on, okay, we convert, we'll do this," but they never actually did. So that's what they say here. They talked about it, but they never did. So that's why the Pope Innocent III, I can't get over this, that Pope Innocent III is doing all this butchery. But Pope Innocent III was justified in saying that the Albigenses were worse than the Saracens, and still he counseled moderation and disapproved of the selfish policy adopted by Simon of Montfort. So here again, Catholic Church making excuses that saying that Simon of Montfort was selfish and he's all fault that it's get out of hand. We have nothing to do with this. He did it. He's at fault. So no responsibility, no involvement. We are just the innocent saints who, what? So, so then it reads on. What the church combated was principles that led directly not only to the ruin of Christianity, meaning the Catholic Church, because the Catholic Church was the only representative of Christianity, but to the very extinction of the human race. And that gets me up because it's another lie that the Catholic Church invented to have an excuse for what they did. And it is made up. And they combated the Cathars because their own existence was at stake. And that is probably true. Because who would follow a Christian religion that preaches on Sundays the love of God and salvation, and during the week they run around killing people? So that is called what we call today hypocrisy. Or do they follow a religion that preaches the love of God and oneness with God and actually provided a way and live by example what they preached? The answer is clear. So they fought, they had to eliminate the Cathars if they wanted to survive and as an organization. But here in the extinction of the human race, they play this part as if the Cathars taught or demanded that to abstain, everybody had to abstain from sexual interactions, and it was all sin. And because they never had children, then the human race would be extinct, which is an absolute lie. And they made it up in order to justify their atrocities and the evil they have committed. So here on the Catholic website, we see the arrogance of the Catholic Church to to justify the evil and the atrocities they have done. On one hand, they admit that the Cathars were a Christian organization, but then justifying and annihilating them and putting the blame on other people and so forth. It's exactly what the Catholic Church does and did to today's day. Even today, when we look at the priests who molested and abused the little children, what does the Catholic Church do? What does the Vatican do? Nothing. They hide it, they cover it up, they justify it, they blame the priest, but they never take responsibility for their part in it. So there is an organization of pretentiousness, hypocrisy, and just I don't know. But for my part, the Catholic Church has nothing to do with the love of God and forgiveness and peace, happiness and joy, and the teaching that Jesus brought forth. So that concludes our view at the Cathars and the Catholic Church and what they did with them. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you stay tuned because the drama of the Catholic Church will continue as we look at the next event and their involvement. We're going to look at the Knights Templar and how they were treated by the Catholic Church. So, if you want to continue in the drama of the Catholic Church, stay tuned, and I thank you for watching.